Thomas Sheldon Griggs is my older brother of 4 children. And when we were little, somebody, I think it was mother, gave us nicknames. And my older sister was Dodo, or somebody named him that. Her Tommy was Terrible Tom. And I was Christian Love. And my little brother was Obie Joyful. And Terrible Tom was pretty terrible during his childhood. But the one memory I just keeps coming back this morning, this is not terrible. He turned into a wonderful, he became his opposite. So he became wonderful. But we had a basement and we were cleaning in the basement and he had a broom standing up and he wasn't doing anything. And I'm like, hey, and he goes, I'm working now, just standing here holding this broom. I'm working. And I go, no, you're not. I mean, this is little sibling rivalry, right? And he was talking about his body working, that all the mechanisms of our bodies that are constantly working, even when we're in stillness. And somehow that just stuck in my mind. Anyway, but he became, he played percussion, he sang, he toured in Europe with a choir, and he was in tennis and the captain of the tennis team. He was the king of the coronation ball. He became president of his fraternity, and then he went on and did a lot of cool stuff. And but he really wasn't my brother until he did his some deep inner work with a group of men through the Mankind Project. And then I got my brother back, and that was probably in my many years when we were full adults. It was really nice to get a brother, even though we're both adults. And I hope I qualify as a sister to him. And with that, no, that's the introduction. Hello, welcome, Tommy, Dr. Thomas. I hope you all enjoy this presentation.
Thank you, Whitney. Tommy is fine. It's a more honored title than any other one we've got. It's also interesting because your memories of the same events are different, and you also have memories that I don't have at all. And I don't remember that thing about the broom and I'm working. So it's like, how special is it to know somebody who knows you back then when you were just waking up in the world? The Terrible Tom actually has a tag into this presentation because that name did not come from mother. One of us was Lamentations. I don't know who that was. Whether we got different names at different times, but that came from Uncle Jim. Mom's brother was the one who called me Terrible Tom, the People's Choice. And the reason that's relevant to this conversation about confidentiality and psychic safety is I was off the charts, attention different. And in our family, you probably heard me talk about this before, we don't use the term because it applies to me and my daughter, and it did apply to my son when he was alive. We don't allow people to call us deficient and disordered, attention deficit disorder. It's fine to be different, but it's not okay to be called names with medical justification and as if the DSM-4 were some kind of holy writ. So I was bouncing in and out of groups the whole time I was growing up. I got thrown out of Cub Scouts. I got thrown out of and I was kind of disinvited to every educational environment that I ever got near. And it was all because my attention didn't want to sit in a room and sit in rows and do things on time like, farmers do. So there's a great book called Hunters in a Farmer's World. That's the subtitle of Tom Hartman's book about attention. Unfortunately, he called it Attention Deficit, A Different Perception. And the subtitle was Hunters in a Farmer's World. So looking at cultural anthropology, he noticed that the traits that people like me have are excellent for hunter-gatherers, that we excel in that environment. But when civilization shifted over and we started to store grain and created civilizations. Then farmers set up the school systems. And the school systems have everybody sitting in rows, at least when I was growing up, and doing the same thing at the same time every day. And if you looked out the window at the squirrel or the fox or whatever, then you got in trouble. You had to pay attention. So I was, in fact, liberated by that book and that perception and that understanding that the medical diagnosis does not control the world. And so actually, I wasn't going to tell you this story, but since it's up, actually, after I went through my clinical training, I went to a seminar, professional seminar about attention difference. And as I sat in the front row, because I knew if I sat in the back row, this is with a world-renowned expert who wrote one of the major books, Driven to Distraction. And I wanted to learn about the latest thinking about this issue because it was such a common thing. It was shown up in clinical practice. And so I'm in the front row so I could focus and pay attention and not be distracted. And by 10 o'clock in the morning, I was so angry, I had to get up and leave the seminar. I felt so offended. And so I was just trashed because the expert in the front of the room and other people they were telling the story of my life, but they were doing it in either a pitying way or they were laughing at us. All the stories were about, how unfortunate it is that we are the way we are and all the trouble that we have. And I was not expecting that experience when I went into the room. And so that's an example of an environment that is not safe for some people. It's not safe for people who are different to go there and to be described as, in a pitying way, as deficient and disordered. You see? So I'm sure all of us have had some experience somewhere in our lives when we've been in a group where it wasn't comfortable. It didn't feel safe to be who we were, or it didn't feel safe to do what it was we were charged to do. So this conversation came up in our dream group a couple months ago. And we talked a little bit about the idea of confidentiality and what does it mean and how do you achieve it. But the conversation about confidentiality is simply one example of one of the variables that contribute to the experience of psychic safety in a group. And there's a lot of them. So psychic safety is the bigger conversation. Confidentiality is just one example, which we will play with today. So let's see. So let me just say before I show you a couple of slides that part of the reason this is of interest to me is because of what I just told you, that little story. Not being understood for who we are with our differences is a core for a lot of psychic endangerment. And so I was fortunate enough to spend decades in the field of consulting and training in working with cultural differences. And at the core, that enterprise is recognizing differences, then understanding them, and then accepting them and utilizing them. So, but the recognition that differences even exist and understanding why they matter are the first two steps. So I'll share with you a few guidelines in a few minutes. They're agreements about what it takes to be safe, to be different in a room. And in some respects, that's the ultimate test of psychic safety is, can I be different from everybody else who's in the room? Whether that's based on age or gender or ability or economics or whatever the power differential is, color, so on. So that was the origin, I guess, of my interest in this subject. But then I was trained as a a family and group therapist back in the 70s, and learned about the idea of a container, a group as a container, and learned about boundaries. And I learned about what it takes to puncture a hole in the container so that the safety and the energy leaks out of the group. It becomes less potent, less effective, and less safe, depending on how many breaches there are to the boundary, the perimeter of the container. And there's a lot of ways to either make a group feel not safe, and accordingly, there's a lot of ways to make a group environment safe. But then another cut at this is that I was working in hospitals early in my professional life, and I was working on locked psychiatric units, and so boundaries were really important in that environment. The environment needed to be well controlled so that people could be safe. So I learned a lot about that at an extreme level, working with people who were psychotic. But at the same time, there was this so-called value of confidentiality that they talked about in the hospitals, and this is in the 70s again. And what I noticed was, even though people were talking about how important patient confidentiality was, it was a complete joke. I mean, everywhere you went, there were examples of it being compromised. Go down to the cafeteria for a sandwich, and you'd hear people talking about patients just without any consideration at all. Get on the elevator, and you hear the same thing. And up on the unit, same thing. So even though we were saying it was important, and this is before HIPAA, it was clear to me that it was a name or was a value posted on the wall, but it wasn't doing anything. It wasn't really protecting anybody. So that was another cut at this idea. And then I mentioned convening groups to talk about heavily value-laden and emotional subjects like oppression, and people working out differences in these heavily value-laden conversations. We needed to have a container that was safe and tight and protective of people. Now, not all groups and all containers have the same degree or need for such protection, and we live in all different kinds of groups, all different kinds of boundaries. And the last thing I'd say about my interest in this is that when I got into teaching leadership and teaching leaders how to create and work with, maintain teams, and run meetings that were not only safe, but were exciting and people wanted to come back to the meetings, the whole issue came up again about understanding a perimeter and being able to protect the perimeter from intrusion, as it were. There's a lot of, one of my favorite examples that always comes up is the leaf blower right outside the window. That's a breach to the boundary of the meeting. And if we don't handle it, everybody's uncomfortable. And even though the leader of the circle, even though the facilitator is not the one with the leaf blower, the facilitator will get tagged with responsibility to make things, to handle those kinds of things. So let me see if I can share my screen and make a few other points, and then I'm going to ask you some questions and have you participate in some activities. Let's see. Okay. So might have just a brief definition of what I mean by psychic safety, what I'm referring to. I'm not referring to psychic ability or psychic practice, although that is relevant, because at that realm of perception and communication and experience, boundaries are even more sensitive and even more important to recognize. Oh, and I should say that this is Halloween, And Halloween is traditionally and archetypally the day the boundaries are the thinnest between this world and the unseen world, the other world. And we have ritual and ceremony that allow us to approach that boundary. And we're protected by those rituals and ceremonies, those structures that make it okay to approach the boundary-less world. And costumes are part of that ritual. So it's curious that this lands on Halloween because it's pretty profound subject on this day of the year. So I'm just saying that psychic safety is the experience of security, feeling at ease, and trusting that we will be protected from emotional harm. And that emotional harm could originate inside or come from outside. It might be a condition that's set up where I am called to put myself at risk, like to do an exercise that I don't want to do, that I want to pass on, but I don't pass. And I participate in creating the lack of safety. So that's why it's both originating from others and within. Now, one way to think about the continuum of the need for protection or different degrees of safety, psychic safety, is to recognize the continuum of environments that we live in, experience. So the marketplace is a drive-by space. There are no agreements there about how we will treat each other, except we hope that there will be some shared values that people will adhere to. But there aren't any agreements really. We just hope that there are. So anything can happen in the so-called marketplace. So that's one common space that we're in. And I always say there are two kinds of groups, those that do have agreements and those that don't. And the groups that don't have agreements, the very first thing to do is to establish some agreements. And that's just kind of my preference. I don't go imposing agreements on the marketplace. But if we have a group that's trying to get something done, for example, exploring deep inner feelings, then it becomes more relevant. Another environment is sacred space. And that's where liturgical ceremony, the structure, the artifacts, the rituals of religious ceremony exist. And they're often familiar and repetitive, so people know them, rely on them. And inside that space of that liturgical ceremonial space, then sacraments can be performed because it's a distinct environment. It's distinct from the marketplace. And there's usually an invocation, and at the end, there's a benediction. It's a space that's very clearly bounded. Then there's, I call it learning space. So that's a space like we're in here in the Mastery Circle. It's not the marketplace, but it's not sacred space, although we can kind of dip into that if we want to. And in this, we have certain agreements that we follow, and we read those agreements every time we meet. What we're going to get into in a minute is how rigorous are we about those agreements. And this is true of all groups. There's a continuum of agreements, and there's also a continuum of the rigor with which those agreements are followed. So learning space, and I just referenced the kind of learning space that I have been used to creating when it's time to talk about, the emotional turmoil and drama and pain of the Middle East war, the continuing war there, and how it affects us. We need protection around those kinds of conversations. So that's where learning space comes in. Now, let me just pause there for a second and ask you all if you can give a few examples of a time when you have felt unsafe in a group? Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I came to America when I was a boy, 5 or 6, on the Queen Mary with my mom and dad. And in school, this is in the 50s, way before the Beatles were popular. My accent was the enemy, the redcoats, the British, the snobs. And I didn't even know I had an accent because I couldn't hear my parents' accent. But so I spent a lot of time being persecuted for something, I didn't understand at all. Why? Now I understand it now as an adult and all that, but it was very painful, and it created learning disabilities. I had a hard time reading, spelling. Now I've overcome all those things, but it was not a lot of fun. And that kind of unspoken persecution, really. No one said you're a British accent, we hate that. People just kind of move away from you on the pitch. So that's my experience.
Thank you. Anybody else a specific instance of being in a group where it wasn't safe? Jonathan's laughing. I don't know if it's about this subject or not. You've got so many, you don't know which one to pick, right? Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Sarah. And then I saw you, Olivia.
Well, I think ever since I learned that there is such a thing as a screen recording, I have felt unsafe in this online environments because anybody can record the screen, and not that I don't trust, for example, the people in this group, but it's a matter of how then the data gets stored and how safe is your computer and how, you know, it just has become a reason that I don't share very often. And as somebody who facilitates groups, I'm always very, very concerned of, it's my responsibility to protect the confidentiality and to protect that environment. And I feel powerless because there's no way of knowing that somebody is recording. So it's become a big concern for me.
Okay, thank you. Now, notice you may have assumed there that it was only intentional violations of confidentiality, but we're concerned with unintentional violations as well.
Right.
And we're also concerned with well-intentioned violations, not malicious ones. Most of the exceptions, the lack of rigor, are well-intentioned. Thank you, Sarah. Carolyn, what you got? Mute, unmute. Okay, there you go. Oh, no, we don't have you. I see you've got some technical difficulty. I saw your chat. You can see in here, but you can't there. I see you on the grid, but okay. If you get it figured out, pop back in. Levita?
Yeah, this goes back to childhood. I was always ridiculed, picked on, teased, tormented. I mean, the list goes on and on and on because I was taller than everybody else, and name calling, and it just, and because I had curly hair, and this is before product, and and my mother knowing anything to do with the kind of hair that I came in with, and the hurtfulness of all of that. And I would be mocked, and they would, a lot of times a whole group of people would do the mocking. And also financially, it's like in our church, which my mother was a very avid attender, so it was like we were dubbed poor and less than, and and that has been, it'll come up, it comes up still. I'll struggle with it still, where all of these labeling and categories and exclusions, I just lived in a life of other. I grew up as the only Caucasian in a dominant Hispanic community. My dad worked for the studios in Culver City. And so I was the other and ousted right off the bat. I wasn't one of them. And it's something that I benefited from in the long run, but also the trauma of it stays. And having dyslexia, I couldn't
Okay, hang on a
read
second.
out loud.
Hang on a second, Levita.
Yeah.
I'm asking a more specific question
Oh, sorry. Okay,
than you're
go ahead.
answering. Okay, because I do understand that we've all experienced trauma in our lives. And notice that I said the need for psychic safety depends on what environment we're in. And so I'm asking if somebody's got a particular scene, example of a time, specific time you were in a group where it occurred. And so as I listen to you, I hear you talking about many, many different environments over time. You follow me? So because the reason I want to be that specific, that's the whole point of this presentation, is that if we can get specific or precise, and if we can identify which environment we're in, then we can construct the safety that we need. So that's why I'm listening for what was the environment, what was a specific group. Because if it's in the marketplace, you can't impose things there. But if you are in a group where you might be able to strike an agreement of some kind, then that's what we want to learn to do. That's what we can do. That's the reason I'm trying to focus this. Okay. I'll take one more because then I want to shift. And Mary Grace, I saw you next.
That's the reason we have the guidelines for spiritual check-in. That's it. That's where that comes from. And with the women within groups that I was in for years, my experience in groups had frequently been, I've been given advice, and the intention was to be helpful, but giving advice really isn't. Being able to just speak is much more helpful and supportive. And I'd had experiences in groups where there was gossip, and so the confidentiality. So,
okay, gossip inside the group or after you left the group, outside the group? Both.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the guidelines that I learned in the women within, or the e-circles, empowerment circles, are very similar to the ones that we created for Mastery Circle.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's jump right to that. Well, I'll show you one other thing before we do. Let me share my screen. So, forgive me for setting a limit or a boundary on this, but it is essential to what we want to talk about. What space are we in, and therefore what's possible? If we are in a learning space, you know what the Mastery Circle agreements are. These are the guidelines that we use in the other kinds of learning spaces, particularly the heavily value-laden conversations. And notice confidentiality is one of those. All of these can be used to create safety and protection in a group. I'll just highlight a couple here. The try-on guideline means that we all commit to learning together. We all commit to trying on something that we don't already know. We're trying on new thoughts, new feelings, and new behaviors. You pair that with the self-focus, which means not I statements. Self-focus in this context means I will reveal myself to myself. I will disclose what it is that I am learning. I will share the journey of my own discovery about what's emerging, not what I already know. Those two things equalize the field of dialogue. So if you're the president of a university or the general counsel in a firm or the head of a department in an academic university, no matter what your authority or your expertise, if you are a student alongside all the rest of us students, that's the great leveler. And so if we call people who are preaching and teaching back into this guideline, then we're all fellow students, fellow learners. It's one example of how we use that. You can imagine what some of these are. Agree to disagree refers to doing that on purpose in order to engage somebody in a disagreement. It doesn't mean I walk away from you saying, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. It's not that. It's, will you disagree with me? Can we have an agreement to disagree with each other so that I can learn from what's coming up? And you pair that with this try-on of self-focus. I'm trying to discover, so I need to stay with you on this. Can you help me explore and recognize the difference, the disagreement as a difference? Can we process it that way? Oh, and I'll just say, have mercy. That's the one where if somebody, and these are agreements that are struck ahead of time. All groups have people that talk at great length. Sometimes they're dominating and sometimes they're happy-go-lucky, but they're taking up a whole lot of space. Disagreement just means anybody in the circle can say, have mercy. And that means, you know, yield the floor and allow somebody else to speak. And so that people generally enjoy and appreciate that particular one. But I'm going to shut off the share with this. I noticed toward the end of the last cycle of the Tao presentations in 79, this was a quote, keep your word. It is an invitation to trust. Imagine that. Now, what does this mean in terms of confidentiality? Let's play with that for a minute. Let's talk about rigor. So rigor is consistency. And consistency is made easier. The consistency of following a particular instruction or a particular guideline, it's made easier if we can be precise about it. But precision and rigor don't have to be heavy-handed. They can be gentle and they can be cooperative. And all it is clarity. That's really all it is. Rigor is just consistency and clarity. So let's take the confidentiality guideline. Everybody knows what it means, right? It means whatever said of a personal nature will stay in the room. And we don't talk about somebody else's personal material when we leave, right? We all know that. How many of you think that by posting that on the wall, that things become significantly more confidential than they were before it was posted on the wall? Anybody think that things get more confidential because you put it up there? We see one hand. You're a lovely soul, Bill. Yeah, most people are not putting their hands up here. It's not, we realize it's not true. Why is it not true that things become more confidential when we say it's a guideline? Why is that?
Let me just speak to that, since you did call me there. I think it makes people more aware. I mean, it depends on the group and the circumstance, but I think it makes people more aware, even to some degree. So maybe it doesn't completely seal it as confidential, but I think the awareness can be there, or an announcement of that is another example. But you know, just I think it could help. That's all.
Okay, notice that nobody else put their hand up. So the theory, this is kind of the point, the theory is that we will be more aware and therefore we'll do a better job. In my experience, that isn't true. We don't really do a better job. Now, why don't we? Why don't we do a better job? Well, just to cut to the chase, it's because individually, and I've asked groups this question many times, it's because I believe that I'm doing a good job. And I think if there's going to be a breach, it's going to be somebody else. Moreover, I define confidentiality in a particular way. I think of it as being malicious or with it, and like gossip or an intent to harm. But as we said, and we also don't define confidentiality rigorously. Like if you think of it as 100% following that guideline 100% of the time, how many of you would say you are 100% rigorous about that guideline? Some people will, but most people would say they're not 100% rigorous 100% of the time. That leads us into this fun question, which I'd like you to take a shot at now. What are your exceptions if you are not 100% rigorous about confidentiality? What are the exceptions that you make? And what explanations do you have for yourself for why you're bending that rule or that guideline? Because it's not all perfectly black and white. Some of it is like, sometimes people think, oh, if I don't use the name, I can tell their story. But what happens when you tell a story about somebody else's personal stuff without using their name? It often sets up a hunger for other people to try to figure out who that was. And so they would say, oh, so there was some drama in the group. They say, oh yeah, but he's okay. Oh, now I know it's a guy. Now I know, which guy was that? Well, it's not Jonathan, it's not Bill. Oh, maybe it's Dana. And so I go, oh, so did Dana have trouble in that group? Yeah, but he's fine. See, we have a hunger to discover drama. It's like looking at the car accident or whatever. And we will try to piece it together. Now, let me flip it to you. Can you give me some examples of what your rationale is for making exceptions to 100% rigor on this? And let's assume that everybody has one, if you will. Go with me on this. I can hear you now, Carolyn. You're back in the world. How many of you are in a bonded relationship, say with a spouse, a life partner? Do you have an agreement that you can tell your life partner everything? No? Some people do. It's really common. Now, Martha, go ahead. What's your handle for?
I was just going to say that it seems like we tend to judge other people by behavior, but ourselves by our intent. So if somebody else said something about you behind your back, you'd be really mad and you'd judge that as wrong. But you might say to yourself, well, I didn't mean anything by it. So you give yourself a pass because your intention was okay. Like, oh, I was just doing it because I needed to get it off my chest, or I was just doing it because it would help so-and-so. But if you're looking at someone else doing the exact same thing, you'll judge the behavior and go, they told my story to somebody. So sometimes that's how we give ourselves a pass to breach confidentiality.
Indeed, intent is a big issue because most breaches are positively intended. Most breaches are meant to be helpful, and we explain them to ourselves out of caring. But that doesn't mean they're not breaches because we did it without permission. Anybody coming up with anything? Sarah?
Well, one is as you mentioned, with a spouse or a partner, you kind of think that, they're the exception because, they're my spouse. But another thing is when, I would maybe tell your story to my neighbor. Well, my neighbor doesn't know you, so it doesn't matter. I can share. That would be another example.
How many of you assume that nobody in France knows anybody in California? If I'm traveling to another part of the world, I can probably tell the story with impunity because I'm assuming that nobody knows anybody there. But how many of us have had the experience of, oh my gosh, you know so-and-so? So it is an exception, and it's one that we think is probably harmless. the point here is that it is an exception. What else? There's the spouse. Oh, there's professional. How about professional rationalizations for telling a story about somebody else's personal experience? Michelle, go ahead. Embo.
So this is really a great conversation, Thomas, because I think in this world where we say, well, you know, give us an example of how you help somebody with the work that you do. And we need to make sure that you've got somebody's permission to be able to do that. And I think for myself, it's been challenging because I have a rule inside my workshops that we don't ever share someone's story outside of it without their permission. That includes me. And so sometimes, you know, I have found myself sometimes wishing that I could tell about an experience somebody had because it strengthens the power of what I do. And yet I've made a commitment around that to people. And unless I go back and get permission, I'm out of integrity with myself and with where I stand. And I've struggled with that sometimes because the temptation is to want to illustrate, and yet I'm bound by that agreement not to do that, not even to do that in a way that maybe they don't know who that person is. It's still their story. It's been challenging, particularly to try to circle back and find somebody that say, can I tell it, or is it okay, or how can I do it? But it's because we're all being asked all the time, give us examples, give us examples. And what to give examples, and at least in the work, in my work, it means telling something about somebody, their story.
Well, you're right in the crosshairs of it. Yeah. And you are giving one of the primary solutions. Many people, when they get into this conversation about being rigorous about confidentiality, assume that means they cannot talk at all ever again. They can't tell anything about anything. They can't tell their own story. I mean, I see that as well. No, it's about the permission. It is about the agreement. So it's not that hard to get agreements and get permission about things. It's just a step that we often don't take. So the prescription, the request, is that if we are in a place, an environment where we're wanting to definitely increase confidentiality, the way to do that is to talk about the exceptions that we make, bring them up, as we turn ourselves in, as it were, and engage other people about the exceptions that they are making. And then when something sensitive comes up, we have the option to go through that negotiation. And when we see each other going through those negotiations and getting that permission and finding out what is okay and isn't, then the belief in confidentiality goes up. But it's through those active transactions. It's not through an assumption that things are tight. Any others? Yeah, Eugenia?
Thomas, I just want to let you know that we have about 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Eugenia.
Thank you. So I'm just thinking about, you know, I have that thing about, well, I have a friend, you know, that thing about talking about something. There's that. And I'm also thinking about, what about when someone dies, then you can't obviously get their permission. And then if you choose to break that confidentiality after someone isn't around, I'm just thinking about that. I mean, I don't have any answers. I'm just curious.
Thank you. It is in the act of bringing up the question that things get safer. It isn't in having a great answer that fits everything. My immediate response was, oh, well, I believe we can communicate with people across the veil. And I believe that I could get permission from an ancestor to tell a story. But not everybody believes that. But the important thing is, let's do this. Yeah. That's a good one. I'm in a different place, or the other person's in a different place. I saw another hand. Bill?
Yeah, I had raised earlier, and I think pretty much their other comment kind of covered everything I had. But I just wanted to, just one little kind of reaction where you had laid out the different kinds of spaces and identified us as a learning space. But I think that we have elements of the sacred space as well, because we do have the ritual of it. We do have an opening meditation and a closing prayer. So I would submit that we do sort of tend in that direction. That's all.
Yeah, I agree with you. We do. Okay, so let's, I'm not seeing any other hands right now, so I want to back up. A minute ago, we talked about the psychic safety in this group, in this room, and today, for example. How many people experience me as making things less safe when I redirected Levita and I put a boundary around her sharing? Anybody experience me as making things less safe? Mim did. Mary Grace did. Thank you. Michelle did. Thank you. I've sent a message to Levita saying I would like to talk to her. Lisa did too. Okay. So what's the agreement then? If I broke an agreement, what was the agreement I broke? There's an unwritten expectation here, I believe, that I crossed a line on. And who can speak to that, Michelle?
Well, all I would say is that when I think about that exchange, perhaps what was missing was more clarity around what you were asking for. Because that's happened to me too, where I felt like I'd been shut down by somebody, and it wasn't that I was trying to go off in a tangent. I just didn't really understand the question. And then I felt penalized or put down or less than because I was corrected publicly in front of others.
Okay. I'm guessing that.
And I've had that experience.
Okay. Anybody else want to check in on this particular question?
I would agree, actually.
That's
They were really well stated, Michelle.
okay. Thank you.
I agree.
Yeah,
Yes.
I guess the word that keeps coming up for me is compassion, and I don't mean that you weren't compassionate. It felt abrupt to me, and that was just
Okay.
my reaction.
So I have something to clean up.
I really appreciate a lot, Thomas, you bringing that up and addressing it. And that makes me feel safer in the group. Safer with you.
Thank you.
So you just did and modeled what I think you're sharing for us to learn. So I appreciate that very much.
Thank you. Mim, I saw your hand. You're still on mute. You're still on mute, Mim.
So sorry. I think I identified with Levita, and I think I might have felt a little bit shamed or corrected. And I want to second what Mary Grace said about appreciating your bringing it up. I really admire you for that. Thank you for that, Thomas.
Thank you, Mim. Welcome back, Levita. Have you heard the conversation where people were speaking?
I have. Yeah, I have. I've been present the whole time.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you coming back. I'm sorry. My intent about why I was containing your sharing is not the point here. The impact is. So I get my impact was publicly correcting you and may have had the impact of shaming you. I understand and I regret that. The option for me is maybe to negotiate with you in that moment a better understanding of what my instruction was, what I was asking, and get your permission to agree to come back to the instruction I had given, because it wasn't clear enough. Is there anything else you need from me right at the moment?
No, I accept responsibility for my feelings and where it's taken me. And it also lined up with Sarah's comment of this is public and it goes on the internet. And I'm really in upset right now and don't really want to talk anymore about it.
Okay, great.
But
Thank
I
you.
appreciate you bringing it up, Thomas. I really respect the fact that you came back around to address it.
Okay, thank you very much. It does raise the question of whether or not we want, I see you, Carolyn, I'll come to you next. It does raise the question of whether we want to have this recorded and published as it was. Maybe there's an institutional level request to not publish this one. I think that should be your call, Levita. And I think, and even if you're the only one who would rather have this not published or a portion of it not published, I would be inclined to honor that. And I don't think it has to be a vote about that. So, and you just said you didn't want to talk further, and I'd like to honor that too. It's your call.
Thank you. And Tim's had his hand up for several times now.
Yeah, I have.
Well, Carolyn was before me, so.
Go ahead, Carolyn. Then I see you, Tim, and I see Patricia.
Okay. Thomas, as I understood your request, it was when someone said something that was not intended to be malicious, but it still made one feel, in this case me, not existent, not acknowledged, not seen. And that was, I was with a group of fellow singers. We were taking a break. We were in my apartment, and there was a fella and a gal there, as well as me. And he was talking, and this was back in the 70s, and he was certainly, obviously, when he was talking about gays, he was talking about gay men, and therefore something that was uncomfortable with himself. And so at one point when we were talking, he said, "Oh yeah, I know of a couple that had 3 children, one of each." And my thought was, gosh, it's as if there are no gay women in the world. It was interesting. So he didn't mean it maliciously. He was just trying to make a joke, and that was interesting. Okay, bye.
Thank you. I want to do a time check, and I'm aware that Tim had his hand up, and so does Patricia. Guidance from you, Sarah?
That's fine. If we can just wrap it up in a couple of minutes.
Okay, so a minute, Tim, and a minute, Patricia.
Sure. Thomas, I really honor your going in with your heart and saying, okay, I think I may have harmed you. That's wonderful how you did that. What happened to me in my body and so forth, when you corrected her, I felt that a little bit. And the way I look at this group is everybody is here to learn, everybody's enthusiastic. And sort of one thing I've learned from my training is do no harm and have compassion. And what came to me immediately was a workaround. And the workaround was, Lovita, that's great, wonderful. Now let's narrow it down a little bit and then give the instruction and let her respond. Because sometimes instructions are a little bit murky. And as you go through the group, it fades a little bit and then people just get into the thing. So I would have honored what she had said, recognizing her exuberance and said, okay, now let's narrow it down and look at it from this angle. And I think you would have gotten what you wanted, and she would have felt very, very supported and wonderful.
Great option. Great option. Thank you. Patricia, you want to bring us home on this?
I agree with Michelle. The instructions were not clear, and when you made a comment to Lovita, I felt it was shaming, and it was. I felt it even in my own body, but I can see that it takes strength and guts to accept publicly how your responsibility, and I applaud you for that.
Thank you. And thank you all for participating in this. That, I think, brings us to a conclusion, such as it is. Back to you, Sarah.
Well, thank you so much, Thomas. This was definitely a very important topic, and I'm glad that you brought it to us.
Let me just do a quickie. Thomas, are you okay with all this?
Yeah, I feel sad, and I'm okay with that.
Okay.
And I also feel trusting, because I know and love Lovita, and I know that we are in a relationship, and I know that if either of us need to, we can talk further about it. So I'm trusting and sad and grateful.
Okay.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you so much. Very rich morning.